So you discussed a bit of the architecture and kind of removed your CTO hat, as you mentioned, and maybe not think about some of the long-term ilities or non-functional requirements. I think the big decision that you've made, as you mentioned, is serverless, right? And so this could be a hot debate potentially, but would love to know from your side, how did you come to that a decision to use serverless? What was the other alternatives that you potentially discussed about during that very short amount of time?
So regarding this, as I mentioned, that this was letting it to be serverless is actually more led in part mostly by the other devs that worked on it, who wanted to work on it, work on such a technology. That being said, I'll let you in on one very small secret right now. It's no longer running on serverless. It's running on Docker containers now. It hasn't been for the past 6 months, I think. uh, but but the code didn't need to change. So so uh, so 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 well, the initial goal was that, right? The benefit, I would say, right, it was also because it was meant to be a learning point on what's the benefit and the strength and the weaknesses of it. Frankly, in one sense, I'm a little bit caught off guard on this, but I actually intended to write a rather lengthy article on comparing the different serverless technologies and their strength and weaknesses of it, because those were we internally made it a learning point of what makes serverless good or bad through this exercise, effectively through this project. Fortunately, I have not written that article, but if I were to summarize it collectively, right? One of the most interesting thing is that there are definitely pros and cons compared to like traditional traditional application servers per se. I will be brutally honest on this. Like, majority of developers, right, working on their server technology backends, right, how many of them will truly run a service that is 24/7 with continuous steady workload? And it's going to be a very small minority. I mean, it is technically the end goal of all startups to be a global technology and used by everywhere around the world. But beyond the startup scene, like take for example in Singapore, you got your MyInfo, you got your banking, you got your digital services. These are all government services the entire country rely on. They don't run 24/7. They sometimes have downtime at 2 a.m. That's the reality of it. And their majority of their workload is not 24/7. It's most of the time within the day. And serverless excels very well if you do not hit a certain minimum threshold of, let's say, 1 million requests per day distributed across the day. This is a very big number. For some people it can be 1,000, for some people it can be 10 million. But if it doesn't hit a certain threshold of the amount of CPU or RAM, it works well because, in a sense, that you don't pay for the time that it's not working. That being said, right, there's a huge difference between different serverless technology. So for serverless, that you either go to flow, if you really want to reap its benefit. Either your API service is very lightweight in the so you're the InboxKitten is in this category. Our serverless backend hardly does anything. It's just reading from one API, connecting the data from another API, massage it, and then output it. So it's extremely lightweight. You either be in this category or you actually be in the other extreme category. Your API request requires a lot of CPU and RAM. Let's say it's generating a giant PDF for one request. Um, the reason why it sits well if you're in either of these two extremes. So in the first one where you're extremely lightweight, right? And if you're really lightweight, like for example, each request under 10 megabytes, for example, you may like serverless technologies like Cloudflare, for example, they charge per the CPU cycle. They don't charge by per second running. So for example, you can have a request that is, let's say, in this case, reading an email and downloading an email and just copying the data over. The CPU cycles is probably less than a few hundred. I'm oversimplifying here, but it can take 10 seconds to download because the client is slow. And you're charged for less than a fraction of a penny because it's only charging the CPU cycle. Um, on the flip side, if you were to do this on AWS, for example, which charge by the per second, there are some there is a downside to it. So for example, if let's say you are connecting with clients, by clients I mean the users, who let's say try to download their emails across let's say a dial connection, and it takes the whole 30 whole seconds, you are going to be billed for that whole 30 seconds for the serverless request. On the flip side, right? If you are generating a giant PDF, which is extremely CPU and RAM intensive, for example, right? You are built for that full 30 seconds and only. And if I were to do it in a non-serverless setup, per se, right, it would actually need to have a extremely large server that is ready on standby for that scenario. Let's say, oh, what if 10 or even 20 or 30 people suddenly creates a PDF in that day, which is very likely, for example, for quite a small, most small medium company. But for the rest of the day, is there a PDF being generated? No. And you're going to purchase that 16 vCPU or 24 vCPU, 32 gigs of RAM server, just sitting down there, not used most of the time. So that's the main strength of it. Now the funny thing is the reason why we flip it back to Dockers and non-serverless for us. Remember I said that if you do not have constant load, this is ideal. We have went way past that stage. We are hitting several hundred thousands of requests consistently every hour. There is a constant load on our servers right now. So much so that we can afford to put dedicated Docker containers on it, and that generally just runs cheaper per request. Past that, frankly, million request trash mark. And that's the thing. And the best part for us was that switch was completely seamless. No one notices it because the API server is written the same thing. We didn't even change a line of code. We just did the build differently and package it differently, and then we deploy differently, and then just change the DNS. And another reason why we also did that is that in the larger scheme of things, because UI runs a lot of browsers, and Chrome, we infamously joke that Chrome hogs a lot of RAM and CPU. Yeah, compared to our entire infrastructure build, the RAM and CPU by InboxKitten is running error by compared to the hundreds and thousands of Chrome instances we run per day. So that was the reason why we end up switching it back to Docker containers once we hit that threshold. And it was interesting in that regards to see the pros and cons accordingly. And also, the only reason why we can switch it seamlessly is because we have our own infra team. That is a factor that is beyond the direct cost benefit of serverless versus non-serverless, that cannot be directly quantified. Because if let's say you as a CTO, for example, let's say you're a you're a PhD student who's okay, I just realized how specific this is to you. So, like, let's say you specialize in AI. This is surprisingly very common. You don't know infra, and it's very hard for you to hire someone who knows infra and to educate that person, because you yourself don't know. And you can end up in a situation where, hey, maybe it's better for us to go serverless when it comes to the API server. And that is beyond the dollars and cents. And that is actually one of the major benefits that the serverless audience try to push forward, because it allows you to focus more on the code and less on the infra. In our case, UILicious is almost 50% an infra company, or give or take. And so that's why we actually do the other direction. We still play around with serverless just because it's fun, to be clear. So we still have a lot of things here and there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eugene. I really love the sort of the points that you touched on serverless. One being cost, in terms of financial costs, right? As you mentioned, nobody's running services that get hits every seconds, basically, right? And the second part is really I guess what some people call in enterprise the total cost of ownership, right? So if you look at not having a DevOps or infra, as you call, I guess that's what you mean by infra, right? Like DevOps
Yeah,
people
right.
to be able to deploy the service. I think serverless is great because I guess it removes that complexity of the infrastructure and DevOps and allows you, that's a cost that's not manifested in terms of your end AWS bill or cloud bill, but it's still manifested in your deployment and your total cost of ownership, basically.
Yep, definitely. Though I would say one of the struggles that some people or CTOs in the coming from the non-serverless land to the serverless land is the very hard mental switch of realizing that total cost of ownership, because the one of the downsides of serverless, and it's not actually, to be clear, it's actually not the fault of serverless to be here, it's just more of like not being disciplined on the coding side, is that I have seen quite a number of startups that actually just end up having runaway serverless costs, mostly because they didn't control their code quality on it to make sure that it runs lean. But frankly, this would have been a problem in a non-serverless land. It's just that in a non-serverless land, your entire server crash and your customer complains. In the serverless land, you get a bill and then you cry over the bill. So I wonder which is the lesser of two evil here. It's a very hard to say thing. Yeah. But as I keep an eye out for
Yeah.
it, the switch will be good.